All right, Alexander, let's talk about Farage and the video he put out yesterday on social media, where Farage says that his current bank has closed his accounts, and he's gone to a bunch of other banks throughout the UK, like a lot of banks. He approached a lot of banks to open up a new account, and those banks refused to work with him. They refused to open up a bank account for Nigel Farage, and he is now saying that he's going to most likely have to leave the United Kingdom because obviously he can't live a normal life without a bank account. And the reason that has been given for this cancellation, this deplatforming, like real life deplatforming, is because of his involvement with Brexit and because of his involvement with RT at one point in time. I do believe he had some sort of contractor show with RT many, many years ago. I believe RT UK, maybe 5 years ago. I'm not sure about the time, but it was a very short-lived show. It wasn't a long-running show or anything like that. But those are the reasons that the banks have given for closing his account and for refusing to open up a bank account with Nigel Farage. Terrifying.
I think so.
News.
I think so. And can I just point out, barely reported in Britain, which is also very alarming. Now, Nigel Farage, whatever your feelings, views about him, I know some people hugely admire him. I know some people don't. But the fact is, he has been one of the major political figures in Britain now for, well, a long time. I mean, at least 10 years, well beyond the before the Brexit referendum. And, you know, he was there, he was active in British politics, he was the leader of a political party that had seats at one time in the British House of Commons. He won large numbers of seats in European Parliament elections. He was a member of the European Parliament representing Britain. And he has now been denied banking facilities in Britain. He's not been given any real explanation as to why this has happened. The explanations that have been given are not real explanations. They're not what I would call bona fide explanations. You're correct, he did have a connection with RT. A Labour MP, Chris Bryant, has alleged he was paid £500,000 at one point, presumably by RT. There's never been any confirmation of that figure. That might just be Chris Bryant's own guesstimates.
What does that matter?
Why does that even matter? That's the point. I mean, this was a purely straightforward commercial contract between Nigel Farage and RT that took place at that time. It's hardly a reason to deny someone banking services. And of course, if it had anything to do with Brexit, well, all I can say is that's purely simple, straightforward political activity. There's no evidence that Farage has acted illegally, that he's engaged in any sort of fraud, that he's done anything with his bank accounts that might suggest any kind of illegal activity. And yet, banking services have been withdrawn from him, and he has been refused banking services by other British banks. Now, that suggests that information has been circulated about him across the banking system. Now, I have been saying, and we've been saying on our programs for some time, that there is now a clear-cut purge underway in Britain of pretty much everybody who was involved in that period of political turbulence in Britain that began with Jeremy Corbyn's election as Labour leader in 2015, witnessed the Brexit referendum in 2016, witnessed the 2017 election, which Jeremy Corbyn came within 2 percentage points of winning, and also the prolonged Brexit war that followed in the British Parliament, culminating in Boris Johnson's election victory in 2019. and in his completion of Brexit in the early weeks of 2020. So everybody who's been associated with that is being picked off. Corbyn is no longer leader of the Labour Party. He's no longer a Labour MP. He won't be allowed to stand as a Labour MP in the forthcoming election. People who are connected to him have been expelled from the Labour Party. There's been a major programme of expelling people from the Labour Party. Boris Johnson, of course, is no longer Prime Minister. We discussed a short time ago in a programme that we did the way in which the Privileges Committee has been used or has acted in order effectively to drive him out of Parliament. We discussed the fact that the Privileges Committee of the House of Commons appears to be acting against other MPs, like people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, who have also criticised it over the Boris Johnson affair. There was an article, by the way, yesterday in The Guardian by its long-standing columnist Simon Jenkins, who's one of the few independent voices left in British media, who echoed our criticisms of the behaviour of the Privileges Committee and said that he thought this was disproportionate and wrong. And of course, we also saw how a few months ago, Liz Truss and Kwarteng, people, I don't like, well, at least Kwarteng, I know him, but Liz Truss I don't agree with. I consider her a disastrous foreign minister. I consider her a terrible prime minister. But the fact is, the way in which her removal from office was engineered, and the way in which Kwarteng's removal from office was engineered, looked to me as if it had been prearranged, and I didn't like it at all. And we see how, as I said, everybody associated with that period in British politics between 2015 2019 has been pushed aside, and now in effect they've gone for arguably the most successful and, let's say it, charismatic politician of them all, who is Nigel Farage. And it's been done. There's been no outcry. There's been no complaint about it. The British media have barely covered the story.
Yeah, you can't bank anymore in the UK, so get out, leave.
Yeah.
Leave and never come back, yeah.
And never come back, yeah. As I said, the decks have been completely cleared. The old establishment is fully in control. They're driving everybody out. Everybody on the margins is being driven out. We've also seen, of course, people like Kit Clarenberg stopped and questioned when they returned to Britain, the British airports. We've seen things like that happen. And as I said, we see what's going on in Britain.
Let's not forget Julian Assange either.
And Julian Assange, of course.
Yeah. So, the UK is not a functioning state anymore.
I would agree. And all of this at a time of deep economic malaise, deep social malaise. All the stops are being pulled out to ensure that the election, which does take place next year, is going to be a very, very, shall we say, controlled affair. I say controlled. The debates are all going to take place within a very, very narrow limit. I think that whoever wins, be it Sunak or Starmer, it's not going to change anything very much. And of course, I've always said that I think the establishment, their preferred person all along, has always been Keir Starmer. And the odds must now be overwhelmingly that he will be the next Prime Minister, but he will not change anything substantial.
Yeah, Starmer's going to win. That's the plan. Do the people of Britain even know what's happening? Do they understand where they're? Just the word on the street. Do they understand where their country's moving towards?
I think that there is. Yeah, I think they do. Is the short answer. I think a lot of people do. I think there is a general sense of this, but as I said, we are a very law-abiding very orderly people. We're not the kind of people to engage in revolutions or anything of that sort. And of course, the other thing to always bear in mind, we don't have a very large independent media like exists in the United States, for example. Where's the independent media? I mean, even publications like, the American Conservative, the Federalist, those sort of publications, which are not, I mean, they may be independent, but they're also almost mainstream. There's nothing like that to anything like the same extent in Britain. And so there isn't really a place in Britain where you can go and you can talk about these things in the way that perhaps is possible in the United States or in France or even to some extent in Germany. That there aren't those alternative places that you can discuss these matters. I mean, there are some publications in Britain that I know people always bring up. I think that their political views, I'm not going to name them, their political views are uncomfortable for many, many people who might in fact otherwise be looking for alternatives that express their views and articulate their concerns.
Yeah. So why is the UK undergoing this purge? I mean, okay, the globalist agenda, I get it. Everyone understands what the globalist agenda is. Everyone understands, stuff like the WEF. There's the conflict in Ukraine. There's central bank digital currencies. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I can see as giving reason to why the establishment, the permanent state, wants to centralize control. But is there anything else that we're missing? I mean, I don't think there's any other country as of yet at this moment. Maybe the United States. You could say the United States, by going after Trump, is moving along that path. But I'm trying to think if there's any other countries at this moment which are going after people, including prominent politicians, in the way that the UK is, outside of Trump in the US.
I don't think in any other country has it been executed so thoroughly and against such a background of silence as we see in Britain. And I think that there is a very simple explanation, and it goes back to what happened in 2016 with the Brexit referendum. And that is, of course, with the Brexit referendum, there were many things behind it, but one of them was that it expressed the enormous dissatisfaction, the sense of enormous opposition in large areas of Britain to the political status quo. And it did so, bear in mind, within just over a decade from the protests against the Iraq War and the feeling in Britain that the Iraq War had been a huge mistake, that the political class had deceived the people over the Iraq War, and that the British military had performed poorly both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And I think that made the British political class collectively feel that their legitimacy was under challenge and that they were at risk of losing control. And then, of course, on top of all of that, they got Jeremy Corbyn appearing on the scene, coming very close to winning an election in 2017, which he had been expected to lose instead disastrously. And I think that was a further shock. And I think it was this sense that they were losing control of the country, that things were no longer as stable as they imagined, that have caused them to react in this way. In other words, it's because they feel fundamentally insecure, and that they're uncertain about the extent to which they enjoy wide support within, or how deep their support within the country truly is. So they've acted, as I said, to clear out the system, to return everything, not back to what it was in, say, 2007, because, of course, there was big opposition at that time to Blair because of the Iraq War. They want to return it to where it was in the sort of mid-1990s, when the establishment was in its pomp, in full control. Everything seemed to be peaceful and stable, and they felt that they felt completely secure at that time. So that's what I think they want to do. But of course, in the 1990s, the economy was surging. The mood in Britain was optimistic. Today, the economy is in decline, and the mood in Britain is pessimistic. It seems to me that the great danger in trying to secure stability in this sort of way is that in the medium to long term, not immediately, I want to stress that, but in the medium to long term, it might actually introduce instability, real instability. Because I think this is a point I also want to make. I don't think any of these people that we've been talking about, Corbyn, Farage, even Johnson, really did threaten the stability of Britain in any serious way.
Well, Johnson definitely not.
Definitely not. Exactly.
He was the establishment.
Yes, he was the establishment. Exactly. So, I mean, I think that this is a massive overreaction. I think the country was stable before. I think that these actions are more likely to make it less stable than it used to be. And I would say also that it also shows that the political class is losing a lot of its old skills. Because once upon a time, they knew, this is one of the reasons why Britain had been stable for such a long time. They understood that, from time to time, there would be these currents within British society. And rather than try to suppress them, they would try to respond to them. And that always has been how the British knew how to keep things in balance. They seem to be losing that knack, and it is very dangerous.
They're starting to eat their own. I mean, Johnson was their guy.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, they went after Johnson. He's their guy. I mean, Corbyn was an outsider. Farage was an outsider. They had different views of things. But, I mean, Johnson was establishment, even though he pushed for Brexit. That was just his way to gain power. I mean, he didn't believe in Brexit.
No.
It was his way to get to 10 Downing Street, so...
I completely agree with that, and I mean, also, the Privileges Committee has started to act in the way that it is, and is being used to target people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is about as establishment as it gets. I mean, he might also have spoken for Brexit, but I mean, he's absolutely, a scion of wealth and establishment power. I mean, you only have to look at the kind of houses that he both inhabits and was born in to understand that. I mean, it shows a degree of nervousness and overreaction, which might actually ultimately feed into the very problems that they think that they're trying to avoid. It's dare I say it's a policeman's way of thinking rather than a politician's. And in Britain, we've never gone that way before. I mean, if one goes back, let me give you two examples. In the 1920s, when the first Labour government was formed, there was a huge amount of uproar and excitement about that, because in those days, Labour was something of a revolutionary party. And the King George V, said, no, they won the election, they must form the government, we'll put them in charge and we'll see what they can do. And that happened, and they did carry out various reforms. And it tamed them. It made them part of the political system. And of course, then they came back into power after the Second World War, and they carried out major social reforms. But Britain overall remained stable. And the Conservative Party at that time adapted to that change, and the stability was preserved. And then, of course, many years later, we got Margaret Thatcher, and she reversed all of this. And again, the country remained basically stable. What is happening now isn't like that. It's different.
Yeah, it's a country in decline, no doubt about it. And police state, you said police, it's the actions of police. The UK is turning into a police state. Yeah, it is. And I think they waited for the Queen to pass.
I think that also may be true, actually. Yeah,
they waited for her. They didn't want her to see. They didn't want her to be around to witness the collapse.
You may very actually, I hadn't thought of that, but you might very well be right, because bear in mind that, I mean, she does give advice. She did give advice to ministers, and we don't know what the full advice was. And of course, she was also very in touch with parts of the civil service, and of course, she belonged to that earlier Britain that I was talking about. I mean, she didn't go back to the 1920s, but she certainly remembered George V, who was her grandfather. and of course she was also she was also she was also princess at the time of the 1945 election, which Labour won, and worked very successfully with many Labour prime ministers.
Yeah. So they timed this all out. Okay. The DURAN.locals.com. We are on Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and Rockfin. Go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.